Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Lati Akiridundwale. The headlines. Russian president uses World War II victory remembrance speech to insist that his country's war in Ukraine is to defend Russia's people there. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg asks Russia to end war in Ukraine immediately. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announces new weapons and other equipment for Ukraine. We begin this morning with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who just a few minutes ago used his Victory Day speech in Moscow's Red Square to tell Russian fighters that they are fighting for the security of Russia now. Mr. Putin congratulated veterans on the Day of Great Victory, which celebrates the then Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany on May the 9th, 1945. That's the end of the Second World War. The Russian president says Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a necessary and timely measure.
Dear veterans, comrades, soldiers and sailors, sergeant and warrant officers, midshipmen and sergeant majors, comrades, officers, generals and admirals, happy Victory Day. Defense of the motherland, when its fate was at stake, was always sacred. This is the feeling of true patriotism that felt the defenders of the Patria Minin-Pozharsky went to Borodino, fought against the enemy near Moscow and Leningrad, Kyiv and Minsk, Stalingrad and Kursk, Sevastopol and Kharkiv. That's how it's happening now, these days. You're fighting for our people in Donbass, for safety of our motherland, of Russia. May 9th of 1945 will forever be perpetuated as a triumph of our one single Soviet people, of its cohesion and spiritual might, unparalleled exploit, both at the front line and at the home front. The Victory Day is close and sacred to each one of us. There is no family in Russia that has not felt the suffering of the Great Patriotic War, and we will always remember that. These days, in the Immortal Regiment marches, the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren are carrying the pictures of their family members, soldiers who fell and remained forever young, and the veterans who left us. We are proud of the generation of victors. We are proud to be their descendants, and it is our right to hold sacred their memory, who told us to be vigilant and to do everything we can to avoid the horror of the war. And Russia has always stood for having equitable and indivisible security system that the entire world community needs of. Last December, we suggested to sign an agreement about the security guarantees. Russia called on for the West to look for the sensible compromises and taking into account interests of each other. But it was in vain. NATO nations did not want to heed our call. It means that in reality, they had different plans, and we saw that. Openly, they were preparing for another punitive operation in Donbass, invading our historical lands, including Crimea. In Kyiv, they were making statements about possible acquiring nuclear weapons. NATO alliance started actively exploring territories next to us. Hence, they were trying to create an unacceptable threat for us, and it was in the vicinity of our borders. Everything was showing at the fact that the clash against neo-Nazis, Bandera followers, that the U.S. and their satellites put a stake on was something that had to happen. We saw how they were deploying troops, how hundreds of foreign instructors started to work, how regularly they were supplying state-of-the-art weapons from NATO countries. It was becoming more and more dangerous with every day, and Russia prevented this hostility. We had to do this, and it was the only right thing to do. The decision of a sovereign, strong, and independent country. The United States of America, especially after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, started to talk about their exclusivity. Thus, they were humiliating not only the entire world, but also their satellites, who had to pretend that they do not notice anything. They had to swallow it all. But we are not the same. Russia has a different character. We will never renounce from our love to our motherland, from our faith, from traditional values, from the customs of our ancestors, from the respect to all nations and cultures. And in the West, these millennial values, they decided to cancel. This moral degradation has become the foundation of cynical falsification of the history of World War II. Russophobia, praising traitors, tormenting the memory of the victims, crossing out the sufferings those who fought for the victory. We know that the American veterans who wanted to come to the parade to Moscow were basically prohibited from doing so. But I want them to know we are proud of your exploits and of your heroic deeds, of your contribution to the victory. We honor all the soldiers of the Allied armies, American, Frenchmen, Englishmen, participants of the resistance movement, soldiers and partisans of China, everyone who crushed Nazism and militarism. Dear comrades, today the militants of Donbass with the soldiers of the Russian army are fighting in their own land, where Svetoslav and Vladimir Monomach were defeating their enemies, of Suvorov and Brusilov were defeating their enemies, where the heroes of the Great Patriotic War were standing their ground, Nikolai Batutin, Kovpak, Ludmila Pavlichenko. And I would like to address our armed forces and to the militants of Donbass. You are fighting for your homeland, for its future, to make
a very impassioned speech from a Russian President Vladimir Putin on the 2022 Victory Day celebration there at Moscow's Red Square. But while that speech was going on, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg used the Victory Day to call on Russia's leader to end the war in Ukraine immediately. He told a German newspaper Der Welt that President Vladimir Putin should pull his troops back from Ukraine and start peace negotiations. Mr. Stoltenberg says the Russian president has regularly used his 9th May address to spread falsehood about the West and criticized NATO. He has rejected Russia's claims that NATO had acted aggressively, insisting that it's a defensive alliance built to secure peace and uphold the values of freedom and democracy. Let's talk to Nigeria's former ambassador to Ukraine, Frank Eso, who joins us from our Abuja studio. I almost got myself caught on that. Ambassador, good morning. Thank you for your time. Welcome.
Yeah, good morning, laddie. It's my pleasure to be here once again.
We took quite a bit of the Russian president's speech there because a significant part of it was devoted to, again, trying to rationalize, explain the reason behind his country's action in Ukraine, even though there were other parts of it where he hearkened back to the then Soviet Union's victory in World War II. Listening to him there, do you get a sense that he's digging in, or is there a kind of shift in emphasis and an attempt to actually justify this to those listening to him around the world?
Well, my perception of that speech is that he's trying to dig in. He's not likely to retreat anytime soon, and the reason is quite obvious. What he set out to achieve, he's not been able to achieve. The thrust to Kyiv was a great failure, and he arranged the troops and sent them to Donbass. And the essence was to try and capture the whole of Donbass. Because at the onset of the war, the rebels in Donetsk and Luhansk were controlling just a third of those two territories. And they needed to capture the entire territories of Donbass. And the progress has been very, very slow. And it doesn't appear as if it's going to make a lot of progress in that direction. So the essence of this speech now, trying to exhort his people, telling them they are fighting for their homeland, it's not something that is likely to resonate in Ukraine. It's difficult for anybody to accept the fact that going into Donbass is because they're trying to save Russians who are living there. The ethnic Russians, but that doesn't mean they are Russian citizens. Just like you have ethnic Ukrainians in Russia who are Russian citizens. I think that distinction has to be made clear. But I believe he wants to dig in, and my sense is that the more he tries to dig in, the more he's likely to get stuck in that region. There isn't much progress made so far, by his troops.
Before this morning, there was a lot of speculation. There were all kinds of rumors about what he was going to use today to do and say. Traditionally in the past, May 9th, 1945, in Russia was used to unveil new military hardware, new weapons, new fighting groups, and all of that. But this year, not much of that was seen, in spite of all the speculation. We also had heard that he was going to declare victory of some sort. But given your answer to the last question, he hasn't been quite able to do that.
Well, there's nothing to cheer about, about Russian intervention so far. I think the intelligence community in Russia got everything wrong. I think they must have used their old data from 2014 when they invaded Crimea and seized it effortlessly, so to speak. I think based on that, they thought it was going to be a walkover going in this time. They did not reckon with the kind of support that is streaming in from the West, nor the training Ukrainian soldiers have received since 2014. And what they've seen on the battlefield so far, after about 2.5 months, that it's not going to be a picnic. And in that respect, he's having difficulty convincing his people that his country is making progress in this war. Now, I read somewhere, I don't know how true that is trying to recall some 60,000 soldiers from Syria to get to Donbass. If that story is anything to go by, it raises 3 issues. Number one, that there has been a depletion of forces among his soldiers in the Donbass area. Secondly, that is looking for fairly experienced troops, since the troops have been fighting ISIL and the other terrorist groups, so to speak, in Syria. He's looking for people with that kind of experience. And thirdly, it would appear too that it's getting to a stage where he might depend on conscripts. And these people don't have the kind of experience he needs to get the kind of victory he wants in the Donbass region. And I believe if so far the troops that are in Donbass, who greatly outnumber the Ukrainians, have not been able to make sufficient success, I don't see what difference these troops is going to bring from Syria will make. So he's in for a very long haul. And I think it's a fiasco, if you ask me. It's beginning to show. And I want to believe, that towards the end of the year, when the sanctions start biting very hard, the capacity to continue on this scale will be greatly diminished, in my view.
One thing that seemed to have surprised a lot of people was the fact that in Mariupol, which had been the center of a great deal of attention, and I'm using that to talk about what is on ground in Ukraine itself, there are talks about the Ukrainians themselves now mounting counteroffensives. But at the same time, when the Russians decided not to storm the steel plant, the Azovstal steel plant in Mariupol, it came as a bit of a surprise. And then over the weekend, we were made to understand that all the civilians, children, elderly, women, and so on, were allowed passage out of that steel plant. Do you think, looking at the situation more broadly, there is a shift in emphasis also on the ground, even from the Ukrainian side as well, given what is going on?
Yeah, to start with, I think the weapons streaming in from the West are beginning to make a difference. Now, the thinking was that if those civilians were evacuated from Mariupol, that the Russians would just storm the place. But then he didn't do that. That's Putin himself. And the reason is very obvious. The people defending the city are more or less, how do I put it now, quote unquote, suicidal. They've given up on life. They've decided they are going to die fighting to protect that city. And for somebody who has decided to die as it were, he can't go down alone. He's likely to go down with a lot of people from the opposing side. And the Russians are very wary that if they storm the place, they might lose so many soldiers. So it is likely the emphasis now is to continue the siege, hoping that sometime in the future, maybe a few weeks or in a month's time, they'll be able to overwhelm the defenders. But I don't see that happening, because there must be a corridor through which those soldiers are still getting weapons, even though the place is almost devastated, as it were.
I know the last time I spoke to you and we talked about peace talks, you, as it's turning out, rather presently suggested that peace talks were off the table until it appeared as if some equilibrium was established. I remember that word you used, equilibrium on both sides. Is there more of an equilibrium now? And do you, in your view, think perhaps if someone, a third party, were to attempt to introduce some level of peace talks, both sides might be more amenable today?
Well, it is not likely. Even if there were any talk of peace engagement, it's not likely Russia will accept that, because Russia has nothing to tell its people right now. And then the essence of going to the war will be questioned. But there's no achievement on ground. All they have are just body bags being sent back to Moscow. And the position of the leader will become very, very shaky if all he has to tell the people is that he has decided to make peace. Here is a man who refused all entreaties before going into Ukraine, because he was so sure that he was going to overrun Ukraine in a matter of weeks. And since that hasn't happened, I mean, where is he going to have the shame, to want to pull out? It's not likely he will do that. And the equilibrium I talked about last time is gradually being established, because I believe Ukrainians are becoming more confident in defending their territory, and they'll keep getting stronger as the days go by. So I think Russia miscalculated in this venture. And like I said last time, the West wants Russia to be sufficiently bled in this war. So there's no way we're going to talk about peace now. That was why, the visit of the Secretary General of the UN to Moscow didn't elicit much from the Russians. Because there's nothing, to tell their people why they are suspending the war. And the way things are, it's a long haul, for Russia in Ukraine.
That's a dire prediction, and I wouldn't bet against it because you have proved right in the past. Thank you so much, Ambassador Frank Eso, for your perspective this morning and for your time.
It's been my pleasure, Lade. Thank you very much.
After the break, Fiji pauses U.S. seizure of Russia-linked super yacht. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. At this point, the Ukrainian military's general staff has said that in Russian-controlled areas of Zaporizhzhia, Russian troops had begun the, quote, seizure of personal documents from the local population without good reason. Ukraine said Russian troops seized the documents to force the local people to take part in the Victory Day commemorations there. Ukraine's military also warned that Russia had located some 19 battalion tactical groups in Russia's Belgorod region just across the border. Those groups likely consist of some 15,200 troops with tanks, missile batteries, and other weaponry. And Ukraine's president has thanked G7 nations after they pledged to deepen Russia's economic isolation over the war in his country. On the eve of Victory Day, as war raged on in his country, President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia had forgotten everything that was important to the victors of World War II. He said the whole free world could see that Ukraine was, quote, the party of good in this war, adding that Russia would lose because evil always loses. Western leaders also used the occasion of Victory Day to denounce Russia's actions in Ukraine. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who visited Ukraine, said Russian President Vladimir Putin was going against the very values that so many people fought and died for. And staying with Mr. Trudeau, he announced new weapons and equipment for Ukraine after an unannounced visit to Kyiv, the capital. Mr. Trudeau, addressing a news conference after talks with President Zelensky, also said Canada was imposing new sanctions on Russian individuals and entities in connection with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mr. Trudeau visited the town of Irpin outside Kyiv, the focal point of fierce battles between Ukrainian and Russian troops before the Russians withdrew late in March. Canada was also providing $25 million to the UN's World Food Programme as part of efforts to uphold food security and would remove trade tariffs on all Ukrainian imports to Canada for next year.
Ambassador Larissa Galatza and I raised the Canadian flag at our embassy here in the capital. She and her team will resume operations here in Kyiv. Building on our recent announcement of the provisions of LAVs and heavy artillery, today I'm announcing more military assistance, drone cameras, satellite imagery, small arms, ammunition, and other supports, including funding for demining operations. Even if the dog barked at me, we're helping fund that. We're providing $25 million to the World Food Programme for food security in Ukraine. We'll be removing trade tariffs on all Ukrainian imports coming to Canada for the next year. And we're bringing forward new sanctions on 40 Russian individuals and 5 entities, oligarchs, close associates of the regime, the defense sector, all of them complicit in Putin's war.
All right, let's talk now to Mr. Dixon Osanje, who's a global security expert. He joins me here in our studios. Morning, Dixon. Thank you for your time. We listened, of course, earlier to Russian President Putin. And just before we came on air, you said that there was an almost immediate reply from President Zelensky saying that they also were part of the victors in 1945 and that this time they would also prevail.
I listened to the Russian speech this morning, and I think it's a self-pity speech and a motivational speech as well to the troops in the battlefield. because it takes the effort of a CEC to motivate its troops in the battlefield, because soldiers are dying every day in Ukraine on both sides. And secondly, he has promised the Ukrainian forces that whoever dies in line of action will be well taken care of. And it's very painful, said by Putin, that they are losing officers and men in the battlefield. And on the other hand, Zelensky released a video and stated very clearly that they also won in the World War II, which lasted over 2,000 days. And he has promised the Russian president that they will win again, and gave credence to his ancestors during the World War II. What is happening in Ukraine, like I earlier said, was a miscalculated war, because I think before you engage the enemy, you must carry out an effective cover analysis in the battlefield. Look at the criticality of the operation, look at the vulnerability, the accessibility, and also the recoverability. But I think the Russian troops or government did not carry out an effective cover analysis. If they had done that, I think they would have sustained victory in the early days of this war. But for now, I'm telling you, except they want this war to last till eternity, which will never. I think Russia is treading on the path of destruction.
On the ground, there have been certain tactical changes. I mean, if we put aside the speeches, there have been certain tactical changes in the sense that on the side of the Russians, the initial idea was to go to Kyiv and overthrow the government.
Oh, yeah.
Then they decided to pull back,
withdraw,
and focus on Donbass and the areas where they were already quite present, and seize those. The Ukrainians started off by being on the defensive.
Okay.
But over time now, we seem to now see that, especially over the last week or so, we're hearing reports that the Ukrainians too are going on the offensive, occasionally launching attacks on the Russians.
Yeah.
And as I asked my previous guest, Ambassador Eso, some sort of stalemate, which is what you were describing in your answer, is being established now. Do you perhaps think that at this point, maybe a third party who brings in the possibility that maybe you guys can talk may stand a better chance than the last time I had you here?
Okay, but Ladi, you see, in the battlefield, as a former soldier of the Nigerian army, I must tell you the truth. In battlefield, there are two mindsets, the enemy mindset and the friendly mindset. The enemy are fighting to die, and if you see someone who is trying to protect his fatherland, such person is fighting to die. Just like, let me take an analogy from Boko Haram, they are fighting to die, while the Nigerian army are fighting to reunite with their family. So the Russian forces are in Ukraine to fight, take victory in the territory in Ukraine, and return back home to reunite with their family. But the Russian forces are fighting to die, to save their motherland. Just like having your elder brother slapping you in the face, your younger brother slapping his elder brother in the face is going to look surprising. So now, when this war broke out, it took the Ukraine by surprise, and that was why part of their, what's it called, airfield base was, destroyed by Russian forces. But right now, as it stands, Ladi, the Ukrainian forces are more motivated than ever before, and I must tell you the truth, they are fighting to die for their country. And if they want to also achieve this victory, the president is playing a big role, and that's leadership-wise, because if the president had taken a ride, the first time he was approached with a ride, Ukraine would have been history, and President Putin would have had a magnanimous May 9 celebration. As it is, he has not taken victory in Ukraine, and I don't think he's going to take victory because of the economic pressure. And Ukraine are receiving a lot of support from the international community. Putin says he tried to speak out, but the West didn't listen to him, and he's putting blame on the West right now, and NATO as well. But let me play the devil's advocate here. What's really led to this war? Let's look at the causative factors. If you look at the causative factors, you discover that Putin is trying to ensure he push out the threat that Ukraine is perceiving. Now, I want to ask a question. For example, if Russia perhaps start having military bases in Canada, Mexico, close to American borderline, I don't think the American would see that friendly. So that is what Putin is perceiving. He's not feeling so comfortable with the presence of those forces within the region. But for me, it was Ukraine fighting to survive, and I think they're going to take victory. The president has promised the world.
So there's very little chance that there will be any kind of peace here?
Oh, no, there's a very little time, because for me, Putin will see it as a slap. on his face if he takes a withdrawal. Now, in a battlefield, there are various phases of war in the battlefield. Withdrawal is not an offense or it's not a crime. You withdraw to replan or to carry out an effective attack against your enemy. Their withdrawal from Kyiv simply implies that as at then, they will not take victory. So they want to go back and also try to see if they could carry out site mapping, you know, how they pick
and
up.
And then decide to pick where the critical areas.
The critical areas. And the West is really behind Russia, the Ukraine. For me, I don't think we need to start, what the West needs to start doing is to still appeal to Putin and ensure we stop this war. Because human lives are being exchanged for territorial gain. And when you exchange human lives for territorial gain, security has been defeated. The world has been failed by our leaders. So I think the world should approach Putin in a diplomatic manner.
Indeed, we hope that, I mean, the NATO Secretary General was quoted this morning as asking that the war should stop. Last week, the UN Secretary General was in Kyiv and in Moscow asking for the same thing. One hopes that at some point that will be heeded. Dixon, Sergey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Ladi.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for all you do.
A court in Fiji has suspended the execution of a United States warrant to seize a $300 million super yacht, which Washington claims is owned by sanctioned Russian oligarch Suleiman Karimov, according to prosecutors. The court granted an interim stay after the company officially registered as the Amadeus owners petitioned judges to stop its seizure. Prosecutors said the case is scheduled to return to court on Thursday, and that the yacht remains in Fiji's police custody. It is also blocked from leaving the Pacific nation's waters despite the warrant suspension. The 348-foot Amadia has been targeted because Mr. Karimov is amongst a group of oligarchs close to Moscow who have been sanctioned by the United States over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the United Kingdom is placing fresh sanctions on Russia and Belarus, including import tariffs on precious metals and export bonds. The UK's Department for International Trade says that the import tariffs, including on platinum and palladium, will target trade worth £1.7 billion, while export bonds worth £250 million will target Russia's manufacturing and heavy industry. The UK has slapped a range of sanctions on Russian companies and individuals since Russia invaded Ukraine with Belarusian help in February. The UK's new sanctions bring total value of products subjected to full or partial import and export sanctions to more than £4 billion. And Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida says his country will take time to phase out Russian oil imports after agreeing on a ban with other G7 nations to counter Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. The G7 nations committed to the move in, quote, a timely and orderly fashion at an online meeting to put further pressure on President Vladimir Putin, although members such as resource-poor Japan depend heavily on Russian fuel. Although it is a very difficult decision for Japan, which is heavily dependent on energy imports, the unity of the G7 is most important at a time like this. We will consider the timing of the reduction or suspension of oil imports while gauging the actual situation, and that's according to Mr. Kishida. Let's talk to our correspondent, Ladi Williams, here in the studio. Ladi, good morning.
Morning.
It's Monday.
Monday, right.
And it's looking not so good.
Yeah, the markets are already looking horrible at this point. First week.
Oh, yeah, first day of the week.
First day of the week.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, so last week it was a rough outing for...
To say the least.
Yeah, to say the least, for major equities market. We saw the NASDAQ actually drop about 4% last week, and that continued up to Friday. Same as Bitcoin, that we've seen Bitcoin, you know, drop by a major amount. It got to a high of about $39,000, pulled back all the way to about 33,000, 34,000 range, and all of this. You know, we saw the Fed actually raise rates, you know, last week by about 50 basis points, but it was less aggressive than the 75 basis points that was expected.
Right.
And we saw the markets actually rally, you know, that day. There was excitement. Okay, the Fed is not going to act crazy, you know, at this point, and we saw a lot of buying pressure. But fast forward next day, everything dropped from the NASDAQ to the Dow Jones Industrial Average and Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, it's still risk off from the investors, perspective. They're saying, you know what, we're seeing the geopolitical headwinds. We're seeing what's happening, with oil. And at the end of the day, risky assets are going to be hard hit. You're going to want to, reduce your exposure. And we've seen, traders do that last week. And even though the Fed did not raise, interest rates as aggressive as they were expecting, they still sold off, and we saw that happen in the markets. And this morning, we're already seeing the futures further drops. Even in Europe, at this point, we're seeing Europe markets actually dropping this morning. So it's not looking cute in the markets.
I have a friend who says that, look, anytime you guys talk about this Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies thing, it's not good for his blood pressure.
Oh, yes, it's not good.
And I say, well, yeah, you better stay out of the market.
Not an easy time for any investor at this point.
Indeed. Let's take a look here, back here at home, though, because we also have issues here. Right. The Manufacturers Association has come out with something about the possibilities of what could happen to our own economy as a result of a prolonged situation of war in Ukraine. What tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, because we've seen the impact, of the war already. We've seen how the rising cost of oil has necessitated the increase in prices of energy. We've seen diesel actually skyrocket at this point. We've seen...
there was going to be an aviation shutdown this morning.
Exactly. We've seen that happen. And even this morning, we saw the telecom operators, talking about proposing to increase, tariffs. So everyone
There's a report over the weekend also saying that the Electricity Regulatory Commission has approved increases in tariffs.
Exactly. So everything is going up. And, the manufacturers are saying, you know what, we know this is happening because of the war. Although prices were on the way up, but this war has stoked, inflation even more. And they're saying if this war actually continues, we're going to see more increases at this point. We're seeing the cost of diesel. We're seeing bakers actually complain. Price of bread, a loaf of bread is about 700 naira, today. So the Manufacturers Association is saying, you know what? They have this index called the Manufacturers CEOs Confidence Index, and it's a quarterly report, that shows the pulse of, the manufacturing sector and how, the CEOs are seeing their operations. And the first quarter of 2022 is already down about 1.5 basis points. It was at 53.9 points. And compared to the first quarter of 2021, that's a reduction. It was about 55 points. So,
and then, of course, the first quarter of 2021, we were still battling with COVID.
Exactly. So now,
I mean, this is
even stoked more with the war, in Ukraine. And what they're saying is, the cause of this is obvious. We're seeing, disposable income of households actually squeezed at this point. Purchasing power is lower. We're seeing rising interest rates globally. So the cost of borrowing is even going up, and the cost of servicing, loans is also going up at this point. So they're saying, you know what, this could actually continue going forward, this year, if this war actually continues, because we've seen the impact already for the first quarter. So the outlook for the second quarter is looking, bleak if the war continues and the rest of the year. So the Manufacturers Association are saying, you know what, we have to look for solutions at this point, because we cannot continue going the way we are if the war, in Ukraine, it continues there. So we need to find shock absorbers, for the Nigerian economy. The government has to start thinking, they need to find a way to, reduce maybe some of the burdens of these, manufacturers. They're also, we've seen the government actually trying to raise revenue at this point, introducing some new taxes. They've been kicking against, most of these taxes. And what they're saying is, we need to find a way to weather this storm and not just, sit back and, let things just go the way it's going.
Now, while there are headwinds for our own economy and people are complaining and already looking at how badly things could be, there's a boom for places, other places. Argentina, which is one of the world's biggest exporters of soy, is having a good time now.
Apparently they're having a good time because now we've seen the countries trying to shift, from buying stuff from Russia at this point. And we know Russia, they're big when it comes to, commodities like wheat, sunflower oil. But Argentina actually they are also like the third largest, producers of wheat and soy. So they're looking at this like, okay, you know what, this is time for us to ramp up production. Let's see how we can, take care of some of these global demands and actually, make some money. By the end of the day, Argentina also they also have issues when it comes to inputs. Fertilizer. Russia is the biggest, exporter of fertilizer at this point, and if they're not able to get the fertilizer they need, they cannot get the kind of production, needed for global supply. So at the end of the day, they still have, some headwinds when it comes to production of some of these commodities. But it's also, a bright side for them, to ramp up production and actually make some sales. But at the end of the day, analysts are saying, you know what, this is the time for Argentina to actually take advantage of some of these shortages, because it's the same way it helped them in 2000. The same the soybean also
brought the economy back.
Brought the economy
at that
back.
time when they were trying to make the
exactly.
switch.
So it's another opportunity for Argentina at this point, but it remains to be seen if they can actually, ramp up production and take advantage of the shortages we're seeing globally.
Indeed, thank you so much, Ladi. But before, just quick answer to this one. Russia is said to be spending $900 million a day.
Right,
on
this
the Ukrainian war. How long can he keep doing that with all the sanctions?
Exactly. I was seeing analysts actually say, you know what, this war will have far-reaching, consequences on the Russian economy even after the war is over, because they're spending a lot of money on this war per day, $900 million. That's a huge sum.
That's a huge sum.
Coupled with sanctions, from the U.S. and their allies. So it's not something that looks like it can, be sustained. That's a lot of cost. Yeah, that's a cost of war.
We'll watch out for that and see what the results are. But for now, Ladi, thanks for the perspective.
Thank you.
After the break, dog receives a medal, an unusual dog that is, receives a medal from Ukraine's president. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Irish rock group U2's frontman Bono and his bandmate The Edge visited the damaged towns of Irpin, Borodianka and Bucha near the Ukrainian capital. Bono praised Ukrainians fighting for their freedom from Russia. The U2 stars walked around Borodianka and spoke to crowds in the center who had gathered to listen to live Ukrainian music. Bono said he had faith in Russia's youth, despite the country's actions in Ukraine, and called the Russian invasion of Ukraine a one-man's war.
I think it's one man's war, really, and I think there's people in Russia younger people know what's going on, and I trust in the younger people in Russia to throw this man out of his office that was so high and is so low right now.
21st century. Can you say that people like you, musicians, people from...
As Russia begins grand celebrations marking the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany, for 97-year-old veteran Ivan Lizhin, who has just lost his home after shelling struck his settlement in Ukraine's east, there's very little to celebrate. Lizhin says shelling in Zolochiv on May the 4th struck near his home, destroying the house he had lived in his whole life. With a collapsed roof, doors and windows blown out and possessions wrecked and covered in debris, Lizhin is now rummaging through the mess to recover what is left intact. The veteran, who joined the army when he was 18, said he fought for the Soviet Union in Poland, Belarus, and even reached Germany. He was decorated for his courage in the fight against Nazi Germany. Wearing a Navy jacket adorned with numerous service medals, Lizhin says he's unsure how to feel now with Russia bombarding Ukraine's east at the door of his hometown in the Kyiv region. A whole lot of medals. Let's check out the boxing. Talking sports there, Russian boxer Dmitry Bivol has refused to let the biggest win of his career go to his head, insisting he's not the best in the world. The Russian successfully defended his World Boxing Association light heavyweight title with a win over Canelo Alvarez by unanimous decision in Las Vegas. All three judges scored the fight in Bivol's favor at the end of 12 rounds. Bivol silenced the sell-out crowd to take his record to 20 wins from 20 fights. Prior to the fights, the Klitschko brothers, Vitaly and Vladimir, had repeatedly called for his ban.
I don't feel I am the best light heavyweight division. I don't feel it because I don't have all belts. You know, if I have all belts, I will feel myself I am the best. But now I am one of the best. Yes, he had a belt in light heavyweight, but I don't feel myself that I'm the king today. No, I just beat Canelo. I just better than him today. I know how people love Canelo, and it's normal, you know. He's the really biggest fighter in the world. He's the champion for 4 weight classes. He has 4 belts, and of course, all people on his side, and no problem for me.
The European Handball Federation Court of Appeal has rejected an appeal from the Russian Handball Federation against a ban on its participation in continental competitions. Russian and Belarusian teams were suspended from competing in the events, while the body refused to allow competitions to be held in the two countries. The RHF and European League outfit HCCSK Moscow sought to overturn the decision in March with the request dismissed by the EHF's Court of Handball. An appeal was then lodged to the EHF Court of Appeal, which is now being rejected. Let's take a look at an update of what is happening in terms of activities on the ground. It's been a long weekend in the war on Ukraine. Here is an update.
The group of 7 most industrialized economies said they had assured Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky of their full solidarity and support, and had agreed to finally be rid of their dependence on Russian oil and gas. Shortly after, the U.S. President Joe Biden announced further sanctions against Russia, targeting the country's media. He banned Americans from providing accounting and consulting services to Russians and sanctioned executives from Gazprom Bank. The sanctions against Gazprom Bank executives is the first involving the trading arm of the Russian gas giant. The U.S. and its allies have so far avoided imposing measures against the gas exporters bank amid fears that it might lead to gas shortage for EU customers. Meanwhile, U.S. top diplomats to Ukraine, Kristina Kyiv, and her team arrived in the Ukrainian capital on Sunday after America's promises to reopen the U.S. embassy in Ukraine. It's the latest step towards the resumption of a full U.S. presence in the Ukrainian capital, after diplomats began returning to the western city of Lviv last month, having left the country ahead of the Russia February 24 invasion out of security concerns.
I'm thrilled to be able to return to Kyiv, as I said earlier, today.
There were a number of high-profile visits to Ukraine this weekend. U.S. First Lady Jill Biden made an unannounced trip to the country on Sunday to show support for the Ukrainian people amid Russia's invasion, visiting a school that is serving as a temporary shelter and meeting Ukraine's First Lady Olena Zelenska, who was making her first public appearance since the Russian invasion began on February 24.
That it was important to show the Ukrainian people that this war has to stop, and this war has been brutal, and that the people of the United States stand with the people of Ukraine.
The Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also made a surprise visit to Kyiv. He reopened the Canadian embassy and was seen raising the Canadian flag, which had been brought down before Russian troops marched into the city. Canada, like other Western countries, has imposed broad economic sanctions on Russia and sent military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The German Parliament President Babel Bass joined the Ukrainian president at the house with chimeras, or Gorodoteski House in Kyiv, on Sunday, as Germany's highest-ranking visitor to the country so far. Bass arrived in the Ukrainian capital to discuss Russia's invasion of Ukraine with President Zelensky and the Prime Minister and to commemorate victims of World War II.
Third degree. And medal for the dedicated service, a service dog called Patron.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky presented a medal to Patron, a Jack Russell Terrier who detects bombs with his nose. The small dog was accompanied by his handler to receive the honor, recognizing his courage before a joint news conference between President Zelensky and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Patron backed during the presentation, wagged his tail, prompting laughter from the audience. Mr. Trudeau patted his pockets as though he was looking for a dog treat. The bomb-sniffing dog sat between his handler's legs following the presentation, looking up as if to receive a scratch under his chin. Situations bring up unlikely and unexpected heroes, Patron being one of them. And it's on that note that we end this morning's show, the Russian invasion. Do join us at 5 o'clock for an update. But for now, do go out there and have yourselves a wonderful Monday and rest of the week. I'm Ladi Akari.